right, so I would like to welcome our viewers to Phenomenology of the Phenomenon. This is a series where we discuss the application of the philosophical tradition of phenomenology to the study of unidentified aerial phenomena and close encounters. I am the host, Kimberly Engels, and the series is produced by the Society for UAP Studies. I'm very excited about my guest today, who is Dr. Jeffrey J. Kripal, the J. Newton Rayzor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University. So, Jeff, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Yeah, no, it's. I'm looking forward to this too, actually, Kim.
Okay, good.
I don't talk to a phenomenologist every day, by the way.
All right, that's a good tone to set here.
Yeah.
So our viewers can learn a little bit more about Jeff. He sent me a very wonderful bio here. Jeff is the J. Newton Rayzor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice, where he also hosts the Archives of the Impossible collection and conference series. He co-directs the Center for Theory and Research at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, sits on numerous advisory boards in the US and Europe involving the nature of consciousness and the human, social, and natural sciences. Most recently, he is the author of the Superhumanities, Historical Precedents, Moral Objections, New Realities, where he intuits an emerging order of knowledge that can engage in robust moral criticism, but also affirm the superhuman or non-human dimensions of our histories and futures. And most recently, which we're going to discuss today, How to Think Impossibly, about souls, UFOs, time belief, and everything else, his most recent book, which thinks with experiencers of the extreme toward a future form of theory that does not separate the mental and the material. He is presently working on a 3-volume study of paranormal currents in the sciences, modern esoteric literature, and the hidden history of science fiction, collectively entitled The Super Story, Science Fiction, and Some Emergent Mythologies. So, Jeff, that's quite the bio, quite impressive. And again, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Before we dive into talking about your book, which I really enjoyed, first of all, it was one of the best reads I've recently, one of my favorite reads. I want to introduce phenomenology for the viewers in case anyone's joining us for the first time and they don't know what this term refers to. So phenomenology is a philosophical method that's rooted in the rigorous examination of first-person consciousness. Edmund Husserl was the founder of phenomenology, and he advocated a method of bracketing in which we suspend our assumptions regarding the source or origin of what we're interacting with and describe what appears. A phenomenological analysis involves describing exactly what appears to the individual, as well how what appears is received, organized, classified by the conscious subject. With phenomenology, we are very carefully about describing how an object is given to consciousness as a perceptual object, a remembered object, an imagined object, or an imaginal object. While the scientific method is focused on collecting physical evidence that can be objectively verified in controlled conditions, the phenomenological method rigorously examines the experience of the witness, what they saw, heard, sensed, felt, and formed judgments about, and how they integrated this into their experience of self, other, and the world. So, with that as kind of an opener, I really want to dig into how you made use of phenomenology in your book. But I want to start, and you have this whole section in the book specifically on Husserl, which I found really interesting, from coming from my background. And you talk about how Edmund Husserl's method, even though he starts with this position of bracketing out our assumptions and only looking at the description or the description of what appears, being very careful about making that distinction, his method was fundamentally about finding truth, right? Yeah. He wanted to, it was a method for understanding reality itself. So the idea is not about, there's a misconception, I think, about phenomenology that studying the appearances is just studying the appearances and it doesn't tell us anything about the nature of reality, which even the founder of phenomenology himself does not did not think. That's not a position that he held.
No.
So where do you think that misconception comes from? And what can we do to kind of change this idea that the appearance can never give us any understanding of reality?
When I was in graduate school in 1980s and the early 90s, and we learned the phenomenology of religion. That's what they called it. And we were told, well, this is not what Husserl was about. But it wasn't, phrase was never explained. And I don't want to attribute too much agency to that. I mean, it's just sort of kind of in the air. I never really gave it much thought. And essentially what though we learned in phenomenology with respect to religion is to bracket out whatever the truth claims of the tradition is. And we learned to just describe the ritual or the teaching or even the experience. We're staying on the surface. And what that gives us, or what that gives people, is assumingly a flat table, where you can compare things fairly and you're not privileging one truth claim over another. And I understand that, and there's certainly a place for that kind of comparison. But when I read, and I didn't actually read Husserl till recently, by the way, I was shocked. I was like, oh my God, this is not what we were taught. This guy's talking about a transcendent science or a transcendent form of consciousness. And what he's actually bracketing out, at least in the material I read, was what he called the natural attitude.
Yes.
It was the sciences and the senses that he was saying we need to bracket out. And so he begins to read to me like a lot of the contemplative traditions that I'm very familiar with in South Asia in particular, but also throughout Asia and throughout Europe, and trying to get at the nature of consciousness as such. And I think you know better than I do, but I guess I do know the humanities really well. We're all Kantians. And now we're Foucauldians, and we're trained to say that no, that you cannot understand what the thing really is. You can only understand how it appears to you, and no, you're just caught in language, and knowledge is power, and all of these sort of things. This sort of postmodern turn or this modern turn that keeps everything on the surface, and then we're kind of lost in this language game essentially, or these identity construction games. And what Edmund Husserl was about was getting outside of all of that and trying to get to the true nature of consciousness, and which he did describe in religious terms. I mean, he invoked eternity, and he invoked religious language to talk about the future science of consciousness, which he of course didn't believe he would see. And of course he was right about that. And I'm not sure we're ready for it either. And by we, I mean our communities and our disciplines. I think those of us trying to get to the nature of consciousness are few and far between. Because you only try to get to something if you think it exists. Right? And but I'm also trained in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, in which the whole premise is that human beings can access the nature of mind or reality as such. I mean, that's the whole premise. And there are all these figures in the history of religions that do claim to understand things directly, but not in a cognitive or sensory way. And so I think this comparative mystical literature, as I call it, I think it bears tremendous import on the phenomenological method and can be put in conversation with someone like Husserl. I don't think it can be put in conversation with a lot of later phenomenologists who just think it's a surface phenomenon. And
absolutely.
Yeah. And of course, conventional neuroscience now and science, as you know, I mean, they just think consciousness is an epiphenomenon. It's like it's secreted by the brain somehow through all these neuronal relationships or connections, and it's very much we're lost. I think we're lost. Certainly as a set of disciplines.
So I want to unpack that a little bit more, or just maybe dig in a little bit deeper, because there is something of value to what Kant says. So when you say that we're all conscients, it's he made a distinction that I do think is very useful, like what we get through the senses and what appears, what the image that's constructed in our brains is not necessarily representative of what's really there. So how do you, like in your work, kind of work on bridging that gap, or how do we work with the appearances as potentially revealing of truth?
Okay, so first of all, I think it's a both and. I'm not dismissing Kant or Foucault or Derrida or any of these postmodern methods. The problem, as I say with critical theory, is that it's right.
Right.
It's it's not just right. It's like really, really right. I mean, once you get into it, it's like, oh yeah, that's correct. That's correct. But it's not. That doesn't mean it's adequate.
Yes.
And so my position is that all of these critical methods and theories need to be embraced and affirmed, but we also need to acknowledge that sometimes reality doesn't play by those rules, doesn't play that game. And so to me, it's a matter of adequacy. And what I call thinking with these experiencers is really a phenomenological method, but it's also an acknowledgement that maybe the real can only speak to us in mediated symbols and myths and stories, or weird entities. Maybe, and there is this sort of collapse, at least in my field, between that which is revealed and that which is not revealed, and the idea that religious apparition or a vision is somehow not the thing in itself is not held. Actually, the thing in itself is really expressing itself in those ways, and so we would do well to listen to it and not just read it as another metaphor or another symbol of something that we can get to that's deeper than that. That's what I was struggling with in the book. I mean, and it's a struggle for me because I'm like, I think a lot of human beings, I assume that the symbol or the myth is not that which is there, right? And I think that sometimes that's a good assumption, and sometimes that's probably not a good assumption.
So again, I think this is really important. This idea that the thing in itself could potentially be revealed in these experiences, right? Yeah. That at a certain point, what actually is reality. We think of these, you call them superhuman experiences. There's a lot of ways that we could describe them.
Yeah.
Sometimes call them multidimensional or just transcendent,
right.
Religious experiences of, these impossible things. But it's like when you experience them, and, person after person who had these kind of encounters or these experiences, they use this phrasing, it was realer than real.
Right.
It's like, actually, when I was having that experience, that was reality. Like that was the thing in itself. And so, why might, or I'm trying to think of how to phrase the question. How do we sort that out, right? That's what becomes really difficult, right? If these potentially extreme, impossible, superhuman experiences are what are actually giving us access to reality, and we want to work with that and make that as an ontological claim, what's our best path for kind of, again, like making these distinctions of how the thing in itself is actually revealing itself?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's the comparative challenge.
Okay.
Right? Balancing how things are really quite different in content, but similar in other ways, perhaps in function. And, there are all kinds of images that are used. I'm not sure any of them work. They're all metaphors. And I guess my initial answer to your question is, well, we need to put people in a conversation who are studying religious experiences and extreme experiences and phenomenologists and philosophers, and we need to talk about these things. And so we need to do what we're doing right now. I think the idea that the real can only speak to us through mediated images and symbols and myths is a shocking idea. And this is why I put belief in the subtitle, by the way. I think belief belief can be certainly criticized and seen as a kind of backward obeisance to someone else's altered state, some ancestor, right? I'm believing backwards that in this revelation or this scriptural text or this divine human figure. But belief might be necessary to activate particular states of consciousness and particular dimensions of the human. And so I'm conflicted by that, Kim.
Explain that a little bit more. I think it's important. You said belief might be necessary to activate.
So let me put it really practically.
Sure.
So when I grew up Roman Catholic, and I was told, and I'm sure sincerely, that Roman Catholicism is true because only miracles occur in Roman Catholic history. Well, that's not true, actually. Miracles occur, or spontaneous healings, or people float, or objects materialize. It really, in any tradition, in all traditions. However, maybe it's necessary that you believe a particular religious system for somebody to float or fly, or for something to materialize, or for someone to be healed. In other words, if you think that human beings are spontaneously healed in all cultures and all times, which I do, by the way, I do think that, how do I pray to a God in a hospital to be healed or heal a loved one? I mean, I suppose you can develop a different theology in a more kind of comparative sense of things. But in other words, it might be more effective to pray the rosary, actually, even though I don't think Mary was a virgin. I mean, come on. I mean, so that's what I mean. It's like it might actually be necessary to believe X, Y, and Z to have A, B, and C happen. But that doesn't mean those beliefs are adequate or universal for all human beings for all time.
So just to clarify, and I think I hear you, the belief that it's possible kind of enables those experiences to happen. It opens you up to their manifestation in physical reality. But just because you believed that it was, the Virgin Mary, or that it was, Christ, or whatever religious figure that healed you, does not necessarily mean that belief in what that healing was, or the source of it is universally valid.
What I say in the book is that I believe in belief, but not in beliefs.
Right. I like that.
And again, I mean, people look at me funny when I say that, but I'm like, look, if I sit down with a near-death experiencer and she tells me this elaborate visionary landscape of the afterlife, I think that's mediated. I think she saw that because of her background and culture and what she needed or wanted to see. But I think she had that experience. I think that the transcendence was real, but the content of the transcendence was certainly conditioned and constructed in all the ways we know. And the reason I say that is, if I sign my name to her landscape, I can't sign my name to the next landscape or the next one or the next one. People actually have very different near-death experiences, and yet they all have these near-death experiences. So it's that comparative challenge again that I think is at the root of the phenomenological method, and that's what I mean by thinking with people, but with all people, not just with the ones who happen to reaffirm your own particular worldview.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's why this comparative analysis is so important, because you see it allows us to like detect these patterns which do exist. Like there are commonalities in near-death experiences despite their differences.
Yeah.
But then there's also these variations that appear, and often those variations reflect the individual's cultural background. You know, if they are Christian, they often see Christian figures. If they're Hindu, they see Hindu figures, or whatever their conception of the afterlife is, often influences how that experience presents to them. But you can still see, and I think you've done this very well in a lot of your books, you know, even going back to like the supernatural book that you did with Whitley. I thought there was some really good comparative analysis in there that many times it's a very similar appearance or a very similar phenomenological structure, but it's just being interpreted, or kind of the meaning making of the subject kind of co-creates how that experience unfolds for them.
Right. And that's that both and that I was talking about earlier. I mean, Immanuel Kant was just right, and constructivism is just right. It's just correct. But again, it's not adequate. There's something else going on. And I mean, this is where the phenomenologist comes in. And like, you know, like take the NDE or the near-death experience. I mean, that if you really pay attention to the details of it and the complexity of it, it actually doesn't support a particular religious worldview. And that's really offensive and scandalous to particular religions sometimes. But that's what you see. Okay? Let's be honest about that. I mean, I wrote a book with a near-death experiencer, Elizabeth Crone, and what Elizabeth says a lot actually is that her near-death experience made her less religious, but more spiritual. And what she means by that is not, it's not something vague. It's that she means that it made her more inclusive and more, you know, the God she experienced as unconditional love is not restricted to a particular local branch, a particular synagogue, or a branch of Judaism. It's all people. It's all human. It's all everything. And so it's not that belief or exotic experience end up confirming the worldview all the time. Sometimes they don't. And I guess that those are the places where I think I'm most interested in. And because they seem less constructed to me. They seem more genuine.
More authentic. Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is really interesting. I think we could have a whole conversation about just this, but I wanted to get to a couple other points which are related, obviously. So in the book, you talk a lot about this subject-object distinction, and that's, you know, in phenomenology, that's a distinction that's made a posteriori, you know, after experience. It's not a priori. But it's one of the most fundamental distinctions that's made in experience. You know, when the conscious subject emerges into a practical plane, you know, Sartre says you have the me and the not me, and you know, that's how you construct and are able to navigate the world, is by differentiating kind of the boundaries of the self from the boundaries of other objects and other selves and things like that. And you talk a lot in How to Think Impossibly that these experiences kind of either challenge, blur, rupture that line, that border that we like to draw between the subject and the object. So how has your your exploration of, you know, the testimony of all of these extraordinary, impossible, superhuman experiences, how has it led you to that conclusion, that it kind of forcibly breaks down this subject-object distinction that, you know, is kind of key to our everyday, at least practical experience of the world?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm not sure you want these experiences, you know, and I don't mean Kim, I mean us. I don't, they're not something I would encourage people to seek out. I think they often come in trauma or suffering or illness. And, you know, just as a friend and a human being, you don't want to wish these things on other people. But we assume that people are individual atoms, right? That they're truly individual, and we assume there's an inside and an outside to everyone, including us. So there's like this subjectivity somehow inside Jeff's brain, and it's looking out at these objects, and the objects will behave in predictable material ways. And I think we also assume that the subjectivity is not real, and the objective world is real. So we make all kinds of assumptions about that split. But what happens in comparative mystical literature, which, by the way, I've been involved in since the 80s.
Oh, wow.
So this is not a new conviction. It's actually a very old conviction. What happens in comparative mystical literature is that breaks down. And the person experiences the exterior world as themselves. And you can use language of non-duality or emptiness or nothingness or unity. The different traditions use different languages, and they all have their different nuances and their different value systems. But generally, it's that subject and object distinction breaking down. And so what I do in the book is, I say the world is one, but the human is two.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that, I mean dual aspect monism. The world is ontologically one. In fact, there is no inside, there is no outside. You are a part of the material world, and the material world is a part of you, and it's conscious. There's a consciousness to that world. But epistemologically, our everyday life and the way we sense the world and think and speak, it's two. It's dualistic. It's Kim is not Jeff.
Right.
And that's 99.999% of our reality. But these people who have that 0.001% of to them, it's the most important thing that ever happened to them. Maybe it's the most important thing that ever happened to the species. I mean, they talk like that.
Absolutely.
So, wow, my ears perk up, and I'm like, okay, that's quite a statement. And clearly, this is not just another experience. This is somehow the goal and meaning of life, certainly for this person, and maybe for an entire culture, tradition, and maybe for the species. So, I'm not saying that they're not rare or not unusual, but I don't actually believe in the subject-object split. I think it's largely an illusion of our senses and our brains and our bodies. But it's probably necessary and good. I mean, I'm not questioning it either, Kim. I mean, we need it. I need it to commute into work and, to get up in the day and have coffee. I mean, it's very useful, but I don't think it's ultimately so. And so that's a normative philosophical statement, right?
Absolutely.
But I'm making that normative philosophical assumption in the book, and it's a wager. It's not something I know to be a fact. It's a model that works and keeps all these things on the table in a way I really like.
So, tying this in with UAP or UFO encounters in particular, because I think sometimes people don't follow. Especially if they're really in like the nuts and bolts camp, and they're looking at the scientific, the readings on the instruments and the radars and all of that work. They don't understand what these two conversations have to do with each other. So, I mean, obviously, in my work with experiencers, I can see what the connection is. But how do UFO encounters or UAP experiences in particular tie into this conversation and this?
Well, they do. I mean, they have everything to do with this, because these are physical events that have mental or consciousness altering effects on the witness, and vice versa. To even see a UFO sometimes implies an altered state of consciousness, and I know you can slice off the experiential and just focus on the landing marks or the physics of it or whatever. Yes, you can do that, but you won't be looking at the whole phenomenon. You'll be looking at a slice of it. And yes, you can just focus on the abduction accounts or the experiential accounts and say that's everything. Well, but it's not. There's also this physical stuff going on. So I want to keep all of that on the table at once. And again, dual aspect monism basically insists on that, because remember, the material and the mental arise or split off from the same reality. So there has to be a correspondence between the experiential and the physical. There must be, because that's what the model argues. And again, that's what you see in these accounts. And I think also, if you really get into experiential accounts, what you realize eventually is that things like synchronicity start popping after an encounter. And a synchronicity is basically dual aspect monism. It's basically the physical world corresponding to the mental world. And that makes absolutely no sense. It's not supposed to happen. It's not causally related, but it's related through meaning. It's related through this metaphysics I'm talking about. And so that, again, to me, is just very attractive, because it enables, basically the question is, what does the world have to look like for these things to happen? Well, it has to look like, it has to be a dual aspect monism or something like that. I mean, throw that term out, throw this, I don't care, come up with a new system, but keep everything together and related, because it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in, like Western rationalism, or scientific rationalism as it's emerged, it's this idea of binaries, right? Of dualities, of like physical versus non-physical, or subjective knowledge versus objective knowledge, or the real versus not real, subject versus object, and all. We love these neat categories in terms of the way that we have delineated a system of knowledge. But then the UFO or the UAP kind of appears sometimes, as you've pointed out, in ways that are very disruptive existentially, and sometimes even traumatically for people, depending on the nature of their encounter. And I think that it's just fundamentally challenges all of those like neat lines that we want to draw.
It does.
In those binaries, right? This idea, was it a physical or a mental experience? Was it really physically there, or was it mentally? Usually it's a combination of both, right?
Yeah.
and there were so many ways that it manifested that way. Even if you looked at, John Mack's work in the, going back to abduction or something like that, part of what tuned him into this is that there were so many physical effects of what was going on, but then there were these profound mental experiences that were accompanying it. People having past life experiences, people experiencing what's beyond the veil, that sense of the thing in itself, and they were going through these profound imaginal or psychic mental experiences at the same time, that there was some kind of physical nature to it, that it just blurred all of those lines that we want to draw in order to make things fit neatly into the structured the categories of the academy, perhaps, or just the categories of rationality, right? Or as it's been defined in our culture.
I mean, so I've done a lot of these podcasts, Kim, after the book came out, and they're really helpful because they help me understand what I mean by thinking impossibly. And what I mean by thinking impossibly is not reducing it to your particular worldview. And I don't care what your worldview is. I don't care if that's physics. I don't care if that's evangelical Christianity. I don't care if that's secularism. None of it works. None of it. And I love the UFO because of that. It doesn't fit in. It obliterates all of these notions. And then people say, well, what is it? I'm like, I don't know. That's the whole point. It obliterates me too. Come on. I mean, and somebody like John Mack, I mean, what got Mack into such trouble in the 90s was his very clear argument that the abduction phenomena actually cannot be explained in terms of Western rational
science. Yeah,
it just can't be, and we need to move towards a different metaphysics, a different worldview. And that was just so offensive and shocking to some of his colleagues in the medical school. They tried to fire him and take away his tenure. And so it's a big challenge.
I mean, absolutely, because it pushes up against, again, these categories that people have staked their careers on, right?
Right.
It's infiltrated out through, the entire academic, the Western Academy, right? There's a lovely quote in the book, and I don't have it in front of me, but you say, when you're studying the UFO effectively, you're studying pretty much everything, and you're coming up hard against this realization that the way that we've divided knowledge into these categories within the Western Academy is not helpful, it's not useful, and it doesn't actually reflect the reality that we're embedded in.
Yeah. I said that at the Archives of the Impossible conference too. Is that, and I really believe that, and so I also, I mean, I wish there were more physicists and more biologists and more scientists, and I know there are a lot of scientists involved in it, but I wish there were more, because I really do think you can't understand it without bringing everything in, all the human knowledge, and it's not sufficient either, though. That's the catch. We're not going to solve this one, not at least with these categories and these senses.
These existing categories, right?
Yeah.
And as you said, the limitations of our own senses and the limitations of our own knowledge. Yeah, go ahead.
The other thing, Kim, I mean, this does refer to phenomenology directly, so I've spent many years with experiencers, and they've told me a lot of stories. And one of the things I've noticed is that they never tell the full story. It's weirder than the first thing they tell you.
The first thing they
tell you. And then when you hear more of the story, it gets weirder. And then when you hear more of the story, it gets weirder. And it actually never, ever makes sense. It's like it never returns to some kind of rationality or some kind of easy worldview. And at a certain point, I began to wonder, well, maybe that's the point. Right? And that's, again, what I mean by thinking impossibly. These are entirely impossible according to our present worldview, but maybe the whole point of them is that our worldview is insufficient or not aligned with reality.
Absolutely. And the stories get weirder and weirder, and the fact that they do get so weird, again, that gives the skeptic, or just the person who's very embedded in Western rationalism, to just be like, well, that's absurd, like that's just ridiculous, as you said, like that's just impossible, and that's why the stories are so censored. But when you hear them again and again, as you pointed out, like or when you go through something impossible yourself and you realize how weird some of these experiences are, and how bizarre, and how it really just does challenge the boundaries of rationality, I think, as we understand them. I mean, Jacques Vallée said that when he was investigating the UFO cases, he said the phenomenon negates itself, because some of the things that it's saying are true, and then it issues these statements that are just absurd, and it gives the Western researcher is like, okay, there's nothing to see here, that's an absurd story, like they ask for a glass of water and feed somebody pancakes, and
right. Well, that's why, I mean, the reply to the skeptic, of course, it is absurd. Right. Of course it is, but maybe there's a point to the absurdity. Maybe the absurdity means something, and this is why in the book, again, I use comedians so often, because I really do think a lot of this is really very funny, and absurdity is there's something profound about it,
Absolutely. I mean, Jean-Luc Marion, you probably are more familiar with him than I am, because he's more in theology, and but he had that category of saturated phenomena. Some phenomena that we encounter that do not make sense, cannot be reduced to, the categories of the understanding as articulated by Kant. They don't, you can't just use modality and relation, and they saturate literally all of that. Like they're more than a human mind can make sense of within their horizon of experience, and intentionally so, or maybe that seems to be the whole point, is that they do go beyond our ability to conceptualize them fully or put any kind of category on them.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of philosophy is like that, by the way, Kim. It's like my eyes roll. I'm just like, come on. I mean, that's just not, that's modality and I mean, no.
Breaking everything down into these very simple categories.
Yeah, and
quantity, quality.
But it's similar to like take psychedelics. People will sometimes give me some long letters with numbers and stuff at the chemical. I'm like, what? No, that is not what's going on. Sorry. I mean, okay, yeah, there's some chemistry there, yeah, but that's an abstraction that just pulls us away from, I think, what's actually happening.
Absolutely. Completely agree. So Jeff, one thing that I'm working on, I'm really interested in the conception of human nature, or just the conception of the human that emerges from these experiences.
Yeah.
And the implications of that for thinking about like ethics, right? And there's a division in just the field of ethics, because in addition to phenomenology, I work in ethics. There's this idea that there's theological or religious ethics on one hand, and then there's these secular ethics over here on the other hand. And I think that what really emerges from these experiences is a distinct form of ethical reasoning that kind of sits in the middle of both of those. It's not a religious ethics in the sense that it is, built on any particular scripture or religious rules or particular worldview or theology, but it's certainly a form of ethics that, does not consider the human being as coterminous with the body, or consciousness as coterminous with the body.
Right.
That invokes some conception of transcending beyond this embodiment into some kind of an afterlife. And also a robust sense of interconnectivity, like breaking down that barrier between self and other, and, a sense of interconnectedness that some people would associate with being not secular per se,
Right.
So I guess what my question for you is, is this distinction that we have made, not just for like in terms of ethics, but the way that we try to divide things into the secular versus the religious, or the secular versus the sacred, I feel like that is also something that a distinction that just cannot hold with these experiences. Like, it really kind of bridges both. Like, there's no way to maintain those strict divides that we want to classify things in those terms.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we forget that William James, his great book, The Varieties of Religion, subtitle was something like On the Nature of Man, or an inquiry into the nature of man. And man was human at that point.
Yeah.
And also, but when like the Rhines founded the discipline of parapsychology at Duke, they were after the nature of man as well. That they understood very well that really what became known as psi, or these psychical kind of connections or relationships, really challenge our view of the human in some fundamental way, but also open it up. And, I've written a lot about what I call the sociology of the impossible, by which I mean this sense of relationship or connection that I do think these phenomena express. And again, take a word like telepathy. I mean, it means pathos at a distance. You know when your mother or your grandmother or your child is in trouble or in danger, not when some stranger is. It has to do with emotion and connection. And there's a profound paranormal things happen around husbands and wives who have died, wives who have died. I mean, there's this emotional, it's about love at the end of the day. And I don't mean that in a romantic or
Sure.
a devotional sense. I mean, there's some kind of deep connection between human beings that I think we vastly underestimate. I also think this gets into your question more, and I'll say it this way. I don't think experiencers are authorities of their own experience.
Okay.
In other words, I think a lot of experiencers will tell you, I have no idea why that happened.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means, right?
Sure.
And I was trained in psychoanalysis originally, and the first really big book was Interpretation of Dreams, and dreams are a perfect example of this. You actually wake up in the morning and you don't know what the dream meant.
Right.
So a part of you is telling a story to another part of you, and it's not actually telling you what it means or what it says. So deception and interpretation are woven right into the person. It's not external. Sometimes deception is external, but I think we deceive ourselves, and I think we exist. I think our ultimate deception is that we exist as individuals. When in fact we exist in community and in an ecosystem. So, and this is what I mean by the humanist too, which I probably use a lot in the book. I don't mean there are two things to the human being, but I mean there is this social ego, this embodied identity that's so important to contemporary ethical thinking, but there's also this greater field of consciousness that people do tap into and do experience, and it's often, again, the most important thing of their life. It's not just another experience. And I think both of those things are true. I think we have to pay special attention to the individualized ego as necessary and as us, but this other thing is also us. And so human nature for me is really the ultimate question. And I think we often fall into a kind of enlightenment, individualist, capitalist kind of notion that we have free will and we make these choices and we own things and all this stuff. And okay, we do in this culture, and those are the laws, but we actually don't own anything, by the way,
Right.
and ever. And we come out of women, and we exist together. And I mean, come on, we're in this together. We're not individuals in the way we imagine we are. So,
I mean, and I think, when you were talking about, this illusion of the individual self who makes these practical choices and goes to work, and, the subject as it has been delineated in the modern nation state in Western societies. And it's like, we do those things at one level of experience, and as you're pointing out, a culturally specific level of experience, and one level of who we are, like this level of the embodied self that makes a distinction between subject and object and navigates a practical world. But I think that's something that happens with these experiences.
Yeah,
is that you start to open up to like a multidimensional sense of self. I mean, you call it the superhuman. It's just different terms for the same thing. And then you start to realize that, okay, there is that version of me that is doing these practical things and that is separate from other people. But there's this simultaneously existing right now version of me that is not even me, because there's no boundaries to it, and it is just all kind of one with all that is, right, interconnected. The bigger consciousness that greater field of consciousness that you mentioned that you can tap into. I feel like that's a very common theme that emerges from these experiences, is an understanding of the self as not only existing but also in some ways acting in multiple dimensions at once, and kind of having a sense of self that is separate but is ultimately illusory, and knowing at the same time that those embodied human interactions matter, but there's a bigger level at which these distinctions aren't even there.
Yeah, and what we haven't talked about, but I think is embedded in all your comments, is that's a really cool world.
I think so too.
That's awesome.
I think
That's
it's
awesome.
amazing.
And the reason I use superhuman is because I don't want to use substance or modality or neutral monism. I'm like, God, you're just going to put people to
You're
sleep.
making it less cooler than it is.
Yeah. But if you use superhuman, they're like, oh, that's cool. I'm a superhero. I'm like, whoa, I'm like, oh yeah, you are. But I mean that. And so I do think there's this issue of communication. And I think humanists in particular are really bad at it, frankly. We silo ourselves in these specialist technical languages, and those give us something. Okay, I get that. But they also lock us out of this larger conversation, which I think we should be having,
Absolutely. And again, I think these binaries and these divisions and these ways that we've compartmentalized everything that we do is not ultimately helpful.
But it may be necessary, Kim. I mean,
sure.
Again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. For example, when a physicist puts an equation on the board, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, or when the person, works on my truck or something at the shop, I'm like, I have no idea what you're doing, but I'm putting my life in your hands, actually.
Yeah.
So expertise and technical language is really useful and powerful and important. I don't want to question that, but we also have to find a way to talk about what it is that drives us to a larger public and to our family and our friends and to everyone.
So I mean, I think that's a great kind of turning point, actually, for kind of the last subject I wanted to bring up with you, even though I feel like we could go all day. You outline in the epilogue of your book a very kind of clear, you said kind of, I think you used language of 3 different bars, but it's really a framework of a model for thinking impossibly, right?
Yeah.
And you really advocate for people working in the humanities, philosophy, religion, to be thinking with, people working in the sciences and, beginning with the experiences themselves, leaving them on the table, to use your language, asking, or just beginning with the description of what's appeared, and then moving to being willing to ask the question, what do these experiences suggest about the nature of mind, about the nature of subjectivity, about the nature of our inner life and our mental experience, our inner lived world? And then being willing to take an even bigger step, which I think this is the one that a lot of people aren't willing to take, where you actually ask, what do these experiences reflect about kind of the nature of reality itself that we're embedded in? And, I thought that was a really useful starting point, and I'm someone who I'm trying to work with scientists, like right now, to put this into action, right? To actually kind of model what this kind of thinking might look like and how we might introduce a more integrated form of knowledge where we take our individual expertise and we ask what we both can contribute to a more holistic understanding of what's going on. And so I just wanted to, ask you, what advice do you have for humanities scholars and for scientists as we attempt to really try to put this thinking that you advocate for into action?
That's a big question.
I know.
My sense is there's a basic asymmetry or imbalance here. I do think a lot of humanists and historians read science literature, particularly popular science literature.
Yeah.
I am not sure practicing scientists read a lot of literature or humanities scholarship. And I've also noticed over the years with my scientific colleagues, even the ones who are very sympathetic, they'll often speak about these things after retirement.
Mm.
And I I think they need to speak about them and do work on them while they're active scientists, professionals. And I understand that the grant world and the modes of rewards and tenure and promotion, all that are stacked up against them. Okay, so but they're not actually in the humanities, and and so part of it is I want humanists to be a little more brave and come out of the closet. I think most people are in the closet, Kim. People always ask me, well, how do you deal with all the pushback? And I'm like, what pushback? What pushback? And what I mean by that is, and it's not that there's not pushback. Of course there is. There's a little, but it tends to be silly and dogmatic. And most people, most intellectuals I encounter or work with or go to dinner with after a lecture, they're in the closet.
Right.
They're like, yeah, that happened. I don't know what it means. I'm glad you're talking about it, but I'm not going to talk about it. And so I want humanists to come out of their closets, basically, and I want them to do what you do. I want to make this a kind of focus. And with the UFO or the UAP, I also don't, when humanists turn to that, they'll often say, oh, these are UFO beliefs, or this is a UFO religion. It's a way to dismiss it, really.
It is.
To say it's not really, they're dealing with, whatever they're dealing with, it's not really real. And so I want to object to that. I want to push back on that. And I want us as intellectuals and as public intellectuals to talk and deal with this more. And like with the threat narrative that's out there in the media, to challenge it. But to challenge it collegially and in a friendly fashion. I mean, I know those people who are advancing the threat. They're people with good hearts, and but also, one of the things I say to myself a lot, Kim, is particularly with media and film and television. I'm sharing this secretly in my head. I say, well, you were just my student, and. And what I mean by that is, of course, that person wasn't my student, but they were. I mean, they're like 40 freaking years old, or they're 35 or whatever, and they spent 2 weeks on the topic, or 2 months, or I don't care. And so, I think we have to be a little more bold and a little more confident in what we're doing, and that doesn't mean we have the answers.
Right.
But it does mean neither does anyone else. And to stop pretending that someone has the answers, because they don't. So that's the advice I would give, actually, is be bolder and more confident, but also more intellectually humble, I guess.
I think that's good advice all around, and I kind of second what you say about the pushback. It's not that it doesn't exist. In philosophy, the big thing is that, you're promoting conspiracy theory thinking or something like that, and blah, blah, blah. And, so it's not that it doesn't exist, but it's not nearly as strong as I imagined, or I think as some people imagine it might be. And also, there's a lot of encouragement, actually. A lot of people are interested. I mean, I gave a talk here on my campus at Moy University, and it was very well received. And a lot of people come up to me. I was very interested in that, because I think people experience these things or some version of them, or they're interested in them for their own reasons, and because they are exciting, and this stuff matters. And I think it also. Oh, a really good, a really important thing that you said. I don't remember which book. I think it was the Superhumanities. You were talking about the truth must be depressing. Is that Humanities? Yeah. Well, I mean, but it's so true. It's like there's this, especially in philosophy, sometimes it's just this idea that if it's true, it has to be
right,
meaningless. In some way, it's supposed to strip us of everything that makes life meaningful and robust and profound, and it just wants to strip out of human life all of these experiences that are the most, I think, powerful experiences. As you said many times, some of these are the most profound experience someone will ever have.
Right.
Right? And I think going back to my point about people being interested in this is because it speaks, I think, to something deep within them that they naturally gravitate towards this because it suggests that the truth doesn't have to be depressing, right?
No, it's actually really cool.
It is, right?
Right.
And it suggests we're embedded in a much bigger and more meaningful reality than I think the alternative vision of the world, or the world as presented by the sciences, that mechanical universe, it's not very inspiring. and
Right.
this is,
Right. And we're perceived as the bummers in the room. Kim.
sure.
And of course we often are. Just to give you a final example, when we did the Archives of the Impossible conference, we had over 300,000 views.
Wow.
Okay, an average academic event lecture, you might get 500.
Right. Yeah. If you're lucky.
I mean, it is so far beyond. It's not even close. And that means something. It means there's a hunger out there, and they want people who dedicate their lives to these things and who could speak in ways that are plausible or convincing to speak, and they're really interested in it. And so to me, it's more, again, it's more of a, how do we talk about the humanities to the public, as opposed to how do we do it? Because I think we know how to do it, but we don't know how to talk about it.
Sure, absolutely. How do we make this, publicly accessible? I think is a big part of the equation.
Yeah. So Kim, I'm sorry, I gotta go.
I was gonna wrap it up. This has been a lot of fun.
We'll continue. We will continue this conversation. I am absolutely. I hope we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to thank our viewers for joining us for another episode of Phenomenology of the Phenomenon, a series hosted by the Society for UAP Studies, and I am the host, Kimberly Engels. Thanking you once again, our guest, Jeffrey Kripal. Jeff, thanks so much. I really enjoyed this, and I hope to see you all again in the future.
Right.